Welcome to another Learner's Mindset discussion. I'm Dwayne Hrapnick and my colleague is.
Dr. Talissa Thibodeau.
We're going to be talking about one of our favorite topics today, and that is learning. But we're going to be exploring how the definition of learning or how we view learning can adversely impact the way we set up our learning environments and the way that learning actually unfolds. And quite often, we operate under a partial or sometimes a wrong definition of learning. And that presupposition brings with it a negative impact. So, we're going to take a look at what does learning really mean. We're going to look at a full definition of learning. We're going to take a look at how learning is often used today. We're also going to take a look at the notion of training. I've got a new graduate class that has started in the ADL program, and we just finished a meeting where we had a discussion about why people don't like to change and the issue of the fact that quite often if people don't have the right training, well, then they're not going to implement the technology or implement the processes that will benefit them. And in that discussion, this notion of training came up, and I had the opportunity to ask some questions about what training is and do you really train people or do you train animals? And it was interesting to see the response. And so I've been wanting to have this type of a discussion for a little while, and I think it can be useful. So this is where we're heading.
Mhm.
Any thoughts before we jump into the definitions?
I'm so excited to talk about this topic because I think about my earlier years in education when there was such a push for training, training, training. And when you get there, educators, we sit in the training, oh, what did we learn? Oh, what do we need to do? There was nothing applicable about that. There was nothing that was higher level beyond this is how you do A, B, C, X, Y, Z. And I think that if we're exposed to those types of models in education, that's what we tend to do to our students as well. We train them on the subject area, not necessarily help them integrate ideas or apply. So I hope that we can delve deep into this topic today so that we can make those connections for people who are looking to make meaningful connections through learning and not just training.
We are definitely going to go there. Now, to set the context about how powerful language is, I just want to share a story. A friend of mine, a younger gentleman, is doing some work for an organization. He built a brand new website for this organization, and he was in the process of transferring that website from one internet service provider to another. And when he called the tech support, he said, I want to transfer my domain. Right. And the tech support person, sure, well, we can do that. And they started talking about the process. And then I'm up here in Canada, and the domain that this website resides in ends in a .ca. And this internet service provider said, well, we can't transfer to .ca domains. You need to use somebody else. And this friend of mine was just devastated. He spent a couple of weeks working on this and all this work, and now I can't even get the website up and running. I got a text message from him, and I said, well, you're actually not transferring your domain. You're transferring the website. Your domain stays the same. All that happens is the domain name servers point to a different location. And so when he went back to the tech support people and he said, I just want to transfer my website, not the domain. Oh, sure. No problem. We can do that. One word: transfer my domain, transfer my website, right? The person at the other end had a completely different perspective as to what this gentleman was asking for. He didn't want to transfer the domain, he wanted to transfer the website. So language is powerful, and if we use the wrong terms, people will assume the wrong things. Not only will they assume the wrong things, they can often go off in a tangent or a direction that is negative, that is really not helpful. So this context, I think, is really, really important. So when I hear the term learning, the most popular definition for learning is what I would refer to as the acquisition or the information transfer model of learning. And I've been dealing with this so much that I basically have this memorized, and that is the acquisition of information or the transfer of information by a teacher, experience, or other information.
Mhm.
Transfer information, that's learning. No, it's not.
Mhm.
No, it's not. That only deals with the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. It deals with the regurgitation of information, but that's not learning. Because you and I know as constructivists, learning is much more powerful and much more comprehensive than that. And the learning is the making of meaningful connections.
Mhm.
And when you use that broader definition of learning and refer to learning as making meaningful connections, you move up well above remembering, applying, up into the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, where you've got a synthesis, where you've got evaluation, analysis, synthesis, and creation. That's learning. So if you operate on the lower level definition of learning, you're only operating on a partial definition of learning, not the full definition of learning, right? It's a significant difference. Now, should we deal with training right now, or did you want to comment on the definitions before we move forward?
Maybe I'll provide a segue into that conversation about training versus learning. I hear so many high school teachers. I work in the Texas Academy, so I work with a lot of high schools in the regional area here in Beaumont, Texas. And, the main issue that we hear over and over again is our students can't apply their skills. Well, if we're simply training to do and not learning to think, right? We're training to do and not learning to think, there's something lost there, right? So we're acquiring, the skills we need to pass this test, but we're not really comprehending to a level that would allow us to apply, evaluate, synthesize, do all those things that makes learning meaningful. So hopefully we can address this today and discuss why is that and how can we go about maybe changing this mode of thinking to help our learners and our teachers see a different way, right?
Wonderful segue. Training to do. Oh, that's golden. Is that yours? Can I use that? I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
wonderful. I'm going to
Prompted
cite
by
you.
you.
I'm going to cite you on that one. That one's great. Training to do. That is so significant, and it's also so limiting. One more little story. I was recently at a workshop. I was participating in the workshop, and they called it a training. And there happened to be a friend of mine who's an engineer who was in the training. And as we're going through the workshop, he had several questions coming up about the training and about how these steps fall into place. And as an engineer, he lives in this world of a linear process. And when you tell him that he's going to receive training, well, guess what? You're going to deal with every single step in the process and connect all the pieces. When the person who was leading the workshop wasn't connecting all the pieces, he kept on raising his hands. Well, you missed this and you missed this. And what you're talking about is not really a process and the development of skills. It's more of a philosophy. And
Mm, mm,
and I kind of chuckled because the wrong word. If
mm,
that gentleman would have called it a workshop where we explore ideas and we look at the ideas behind things and we come together and collaborate and work things out in a workshop, then the notion of this step by step or linear process training doesn't come into play. And then those questions about the linear process would not come up. And so, for somebody who lives in that realm of specificity, like an engineer,
mhm,
that language is powerful. I recently also did a workshop up in northern Alberta for a college of trades instructors and people in vocational areas, and they use the term training all the time. And one of their biggest laments is that, well, our students just aren't thinking for themselves. Well, is it the fact that you're training them? You're taking them through this lockstep process, and if you miss one of the steps and you haven't given it to them, they're only actually telling you that you've missed something. Don't you want them to actually be prepared to be able to go out into the workforce and solve real world problems, or do you just want to train them to use this particular tool? And one gentleman says, well, maybe training is the wrong term. We do a little bit of training, but we really want them to be problem solvers and critical analytical thinkers.
mhm,
We want them to operate on that higher levels. I showed them Bloom's taxonomy. No, we want them to be at that synthesis level, especially when they're journeymen, or especially when they're at the higher levels and they're running projects. They have to do all those things. And so, once again, language was limiting where they were going, because when you think of training, you think of that behavioristic notion of condition and response, classical conditioning, right? Stimulus response. It's that behavioristic notion that was introduced by Watson and then really propagated by Skinner and other behaviorists, and that dominates the notion of training. When I was in the military, I received training. But guess what? You don't want a soldier doing the, how shall I close with and kill the enemy? No, you want that soldier to respond instantly. So training often indicates you don't have to think about things. It is a change in behavior. It's conditioning. We refer to training in the physical realm of exercise, or if we're training for discipline. My son is a professional racer. He trains every day. Well, he's training his body. He's training his muscles. He's training his mind. He's training through a process to become better and faster. And he doesn't want to have to think about it. That is training. So if we use the notion of training our students, train to do, and then we wonder why they aren't thinking, maybe the problem is how we started with this notion of training. What are your thoughts on that?
All I could think about when you were talking was, if I think about learning as the acquisition of knowledge, then training makes sense. That's all I need to do. And I stop right there. But if I think about learning as making of meaningful connections, then I think about workshops, I think about collaboration, I think about the learner's mindset and what it takes to turn a challenge into an opportunity. I think about those higher level Bloom's tax skills where you need to be able to synthesize and evaluate, analyze, and take it to that next level. And so it's very simple in my brain. Are we training our students, or are we helping them learn? If your focus is on that training aspect, you'll stay there, you'll exist there, right? But if you focus on learning, yeah, you're going to have some of that training element with it. It kind of reminds me of authentic learning environments when we talk about teaching to the test or teaching knowledge and skills, competencies, state standards, right? That, to me, you're kind of training for the test. That's an easy thing to do. But taking it to the next level of evaluating, synthesizing, project-based learning, authentic learning environments, creating significant learning environments, really is what I'm talking about. That, to me, involves so much more than just training how to do, but it's you're thinking for learning. You're learning to think, and so that elevates the learning experience. And I step back and I think, honors college, Lamar University, what I do here, are we taking that step? Are we moving in that direction? And so this is causing me to rethink, and think again about how I'm phrasing things, or how I am sharing things with my staff, with my faculty, with my students. So this is a really good concept to explore. And it's not just applicable to, teachers and students. It's kindergartners all the way up through high school, graduates, college graduates. We as adults, why are we having this conversation? This is important to us, right? Especially as it relates to the learner's mindset and all of the pieces that we're building within that context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Boy, you've introduced a lot of things that we do
I
need to
know.
address, the learner's mindset. But I think the key thing that you emphasize is that learning to learn, learning to explore, learning is much more. It's that meaningful connection perspective. You also, I think, address something that a lot of people lose sight of. When you operate at those higher levels, right? When you're evaluating, analyzing, and you start to look at how the pieces come together, and you start to build something new or create something different, you never actually stop looking at those foundational levels, right? But you do those intrinsically, and you do those within the context of the real world problem you're solving. And so it's a much more holistic way to learn. And this is really, really important. And this is what those trades instructors up north were alluding to. Yes, a lot of times a mechanic, an electrician, a person who is working on a helicopter, an airframe mechanic, they have to have certain skills and ability. They have to develop the muscle memory. They have to develop the knowledge. But when they are problem solving, when they're looking to solve a real world problem, all those higher order thinking skills come into play, and then they draw upon those more foundational, information transfer type skills as they're solving the problem. It's much more holistic. We need that holistic approach. In our new Learner's Mindset Study Skills course that we are just about to release, it'll probably be released here even before this video gets up. One of the key things that I encourage a learner to do, if you're in an environment where information transfer is the norm, and the most that people are asking you to do is maybe apply something for a test or regurgitate information, I encourage the learner to take a look at the context of what they're learning and then use that context to drive the things that they're doing. I'm using my son as an example. As a professional mountain bike racer, you get to a point where, yeah, the body starts to give out a little bit, and he's planning down, he's still doing okay, but he's planning for the future. So he's going back to school and he's looking at developing some skills and abilities, or develop a discipline that he can actually work in the bike industry and design parts and build a better bike. And so he's looking to add that to his skill base, or add that to his resume. And when he goes to school, he's got a goal in mind. When the instructor is talking about mathematics, when the instructor is talking about anything within that context, I keep on reminding my son, remember, what are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
How is this going to help me? How will this help me when I want to design this particular part for this bike? So everything that he's doing is driven by a context. And so I'm constantly reminding him, always use that context. That question, where are we going to use this, is actually a very important question. And if we were honest with our students in most cases and say, well, it'll be for, you need to do it for this course that you're going to do next. No, where is it used in the real world is what the learner has to ask. And that's what I'm encouraging people through our Learner's Mindset course, to ask that question. And really, if you've got a good instructor, they'll be more than willing to talk about where this is going to be used in the real world. And that real world application provides a context for the learning. And so those lower order thinking skills of the remembering, of the definitions, of some of the basic knowledge and information that you have to actually accumulate and acquire, and then some application of some processes, all that happens as you're working to build something real. So that is a more holistic definition of learning that you would even use in that type of vocational setting. So when we look at K-12, when we look at higher ed, when we look at all those levels, I think we need to use that fuller definition of learning, that notion of making meaningful connections, because with that definition, the other definition is underneath, but it plays its proper role. It supports that level of analysis, that level of evaluation, that level of synthesis and creation. So the lower levels don't go away. They're just done within a different context. And you're not tested on the lower levels. You're actually going to be assessed on what it is that you create. So again, that authentic learning opportunity provides a whole different context. Now, the challenge is, how do we get more people to do that? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, goodness. So I think that we have to step back and reevaluate whether we are teacher-centered or student-focused. And a big thing for me, as you were speaking, I was thinking about ducks, of all things. Not that you look like a duck or anything, but I was thinking about a duck, that a mother duck, and her ducklings kind of follow behind her. And when we follow that teacher-centric, training focus, hey, we're telling all of our ducks, get behind us and walk right behind us and cross the street behind us, and one by one by one by one. Be really careful, because you don't want to step out of line. You might get run over. Well, what about that ugly duckling? What about the duckling that wants to step out of line? I say we flip that around, and kind of turn that line around a bit and do something different, So when I think about that teacher-centric training focus, here we are, all these, we're telling everybody to get behind us and follow us. But what about, and let's revisit this whole notion we talked about a while back about Genius Hour. What about giving people the opportunity to explore? What about those students who have that intrinsic capacity to learn and are shut down by that training focus that we have as teachers? I say we flip that line around, let them ducks go the way they want to go. But, one of the things, and I'm going to apply this in a kind of a weird and unnatural way to my academy students who are applying for undergraduate research opportunities right now. I had a professor email me this morning. Can high school students really do that at Lamar and get a faculty mentor and do undergraduate research? Well, yes, they can. And when you talked about how can they take that experience and allow them to apply that to their bigger picture, many of my academy students or GT, they want to be doctors, lawyers. They've got these big career plans ahead of them. How is undergraduate research going to help them get there? Well, guess what? Undergraduate research is not a class. It is not something that someone is going to tell you exactly what and how to do it. You have to have that intrinsic capacity to learn, learner's mindset, and think about, how will I get there? Who do I want to become? So undergraduate research, if done well and done carefully and matched with a really good faculty mentor that allows that student to explore, make mistakes, and figure learning out for themselves, is stepping out of that duck line, if you will, and going into an uncharted territory where someone's not going to stand over the top of you and tell you what and how to get that A. You're doing this for yourself, right? And then they learn, oh, this helps me become that doctor I want to be, because I'm studying hematology, and that's what I want to do. I want to be a cardiologist, right? So all that to say, how do we get them there? We need to show them opportunities. We need to model this type of thinking for them. We need to step away from the training language and step into that student-centered, we're going to collaborate and do this together. How can you then think about a project that relates to what you're learning, that will help you become who you want to become? And that's how you shift it, right? It's about giving students choice, ownership, and voice in authentic learning environments. And if you can bundle that really nicely into a significant learning environment and motivate those kids who have that intrinsic capacity to learn, who want to turn a challenge into an opportunity, who care, and you show, and you kind of get out of their way. I think that's how we do it. We start by having these little, spotlights, and then it starts to gain some traction. I've noticed that just by learning and sitting and networking with new faculty here at Lamar, do something different, find a different way. That's what I'm thinking.
Well, you are definitely sharing things that I wholeheartedly believe in, and something you and I have been working on for many, many years now. Creating that significant learning environment, giving that student choice, ownership, and voice through that authentic learning opportunity is wonderful. But what about the standardized tests that that student might need to write? So whether you're in K to 12 or you're in higher ed, and more disciplines have some form of a credentialing exam. If you're an engineer, you've got a variety of exams. If you're in other disciplines like nursing or the health industry, there's all kinds of credentialing exams. If you're a helicopter pilot, there's a nasty credentialing exam given up by the federal government here in Canada that is really difficult to pass. It's got nothing to do with actually the trade, but it's just terminology. And so that's the reality that a lot of instructors face. And they get caught up focusing on that information transfer model. And we don't teach the test, but yet you do everything you can to help the student pass a test. And instead of giving the student the skills and abilities to take the notion of space practiced and do it themselves and to quiz themselves, teachers take the regular classroom and they turn it into an extended study session so that the students can pass the test. So rather than giving the student the tools to actually become proficient at information processing, being able to read, being able to take notes, recognizing that the student themselves has to engage in space practice. They have to read before class. They have to actually take effective notes. They have to actually then review that at the end of the class. And then at the end of the day, in that first 24 to 48 hour period, if they can expose themselves to information 4 to 5 times, well, then the retention goes up. But the student needs to do that. And if you give the student the skill and ability to be able to do that, then you can actually engage in bigger projects because the student is acquiring that information. They are then doing the work. They are doing the studying. Every 3 or 4 days, they're reviewing that. They've been building in that information. And because they've got the context of a real world problem that you've given them, they then can actually see how this will work in the real world. And as we've seen in some of the research, students who do active and dynamic learning will do just as well on the test. But more importantly, down the road, 2 weeks, a month down the road, they'll actually do even better on similar tests because they own that. They own the information, it's theirs, and they're applying it to the real world. Whereas somebody who simply memorized and studied and crammed and passed the test or did okay on the test, when they exhale, within 2 weeks, it's gone. There's research to
Yeah.
support that happens, and it happens all too often. It's unfortunate. And so we've got a system and a group of instructors who are afraid to actually use a real world project because their kids or their students or their learners are going to be tested in a very significant way. And so, yeah, we give them that authentic learning opportunity, but I also think we need to focus on that test. And I think through our new study skills course, where we've got a 6 module approach where you take a look at all those 6 components, we address the learner's mindset at the very beginning. We encourage the learner to ask those contextual building questions. We look at the information transfer model. We look at space practice. We look at actual study skills, study abilities. We identify the fact that underlining doesn't help, rereading doesn't help, because most of the time rereading is only done at that inferential level. And so you have to move well beyond recognition of terms into critical and analytical thinking. Well, that means you've got to evaluate. You've got to assess, where does this stuff fit? That is where the real world project comes into being. So I think if we can help our learners to become very proficient at addressing those exams, that will free up time for the teacher and the learner to actually do those projects that will be more meaningful to life. The challenge is taking the risk, right? Most instructors know what it takes to get the students to pass. Most students to pass the exam. They're evaluated on what the test scores are, and so that risk of incorporating a real world project, new study skills, is it going to work? Yeah, it can work. And I think we owe it to our learners to move into a much broader definition of learning, a holistic perspective of learning, help our learners make those meaningful connections, help our learners to be able to deal with the information transfer system of education that we have. You can do this very efficiently. I'm speaking from experience. I was a high school dropout before I went to university. I was a high school dropout. I went into university, did some upgrading, and I stumbled across a lot of the ideas that we've built into our new study skills program. And I realized very, very quickly that all that they were asking me to do was just to give them some information back. Well, I figured out how to actually do that very efficiently. And I had all the time in the world, and I graduated with high distinction, straight A's. It wasn't a problem. It worked. It worked back then. It works now. Whenever I'm looking at something new, I expose myself to that new idea 4, 5, 6 times within that first 24 to 48 hour period. I keep on going back to it, and I make it my own. And once it's my own, it never goes away because you make that meaningful connection. So we have such a wonderful, amazing opportunity in this day and age when all the world's information is available to us in the palms of our hands. We don't need to actually focus on the delivery of information. That is actually solved by these amazing tools, by the computer that we're using, the internet, videos. There's amazing tools that will help in information transfer. So if we can help our learners step up to that higher order thinking, move into that notion of making those meaningful connections, it will change things. But as educators, as parents, as regular people, I think we have to stop using the wrong terminology. Okay? We don't train students. Well, okay, we can if they're athletes and they're training in a very specific context. Yes, I stand corrected. There are times when training makes sense. But unless you're doing something physical, unless you're actually looking at training for a military discipline or some type of a context where you don't have to think, training is all about not thinking. Training is all about that muscle memory, that response, conditioned response. You don't have to think. That's where training has a role. But in most of our educational contexts, we want our learners to think. So we need to move into a definition of learning, move away from training, move into a definition of learning where it isn't just the transfer of information or the acquisition of a skill or acquisition of knowledge, because what are you doing it for? Why are you getting that skill? Where does that skill fit? Where does that knowledge fit? Where does that process fit? That's where the meaningful connection idea of learning, I think, comes into play. That more holistic definition of learning and practice of learning, where you've got that significant learning environment, you've got that authentic learning opportunity, you've got a real world context. And if you give that to your learner, or actually give them the opportunity to choose their own real world context, it's theirs. It doesn't go away. They'll do wonderfully on the test, but more importantly, you've also prepared them for life. So this is where I think we need to go. You and I have been doing it for the last, well, we've been doing it for a long time. And I think it's important for everybody to realize that. As I get involved in more and more workshops and different activities in different organizations, the language that people are using is just so wrong, and it limits what people do. Because when you think of training, we do know what training is. You think of sports, you think of the military. Well, you're just trained to do something. There's a dependency model in there. And if we are dependent on the teacher to train us to do these things without having to think, well, guess what? When we run across something that we haven't been trained in, what do I do now? Whereas if you give the learner the ability to learn how to learn, when they run into that something different, they'll go, wow, that's very similar to what we've done over here. Maybe if I apply some of these ideas here to this new idea, let me give that a try. Oh, well, that worked. Oh, that didn't work. I need to do something different. If we use the right language, if we use the right context, and if we look at a broader perspective of not just preparing our student for the test, or learner for the test, but preparing them for life, I think we're going to do a much, much better job. But we've got to get the language right, we've got to get our definitions right, and we've got to change our focus away from that condition and response, or that regurgitation of information, to where is this going to help me in the real world? It's much different. Thoughts?
I think you summed it up really well. Very clear, and basically said everything I was thinking.
It's interesting. You and I live in the same realm. This is what we've been doing, and I'm so excited to see what you're doing with the Honors College, and I'm excited to see how those honors students are going to be using the study skills course that we've put together, and I think this is exciting. Equipping these young minds and igniting, well, actually not just igniting, their potential is already ignited. We're adding fuel to the fire, right? So you've got these young people who are just excited about taking on the world. And if we can equip them and give them the skills that they need by creating those real contexts, by allowing them to look at that real research project that will have real world implications, that changes everything. It's theirs. It's theirs. So, yeah, we
Let's
we
do
live
it.
in yeah, let's do it. We live in a time of abundance, a world of abundance. I'm excited to see how we're going to change the world one learner at a time.